guys, welcome back to Nadir Audio. In today's video, we're going to be taking a look at this very clean, vintage Nakamichi 480 cassette deck. Okay, so quick disclaimer before we dive into the Nakamichi. In my opinion, you're not going to get the same sound quality from a cassette that you can from vinyl or from a digital file or CD played through a modern DAC. If you want audiophile level sound quality from analog tape, you're probably going to have to upgrade to a reel-to-reel, which is a pretty expensive proposition, definitely outside of my budget. But I do think there are some compelling reasons why you might want to still use cassettes today in 2023 as of the making of this video. So one of which, obviously, if you're my age, if you were a teenager in the 80s and you were into music or hi-fi or making mixtapes, you probably have some nostalgic feelings towards the cassette, and I certainly do too, and that's one reason you might want to do it. Another is that cassettes, while you can't achieve the same level of quality, you can actually achieve a much higher level than I think most people are aware of, especially if you go with a higher end or a really quality cassette deck from the early to mid 80s. But I think there are other reasons as well. For me, one of the big ones is just that I have hundreds of cassettes, and a lot of them are recordings from bands that I played in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, many of which that's the only place they're available. Now, I could certainly transfer those all into digital files, but it's probably not worth the trouble. I don't listen to that stuff often, but it's nice to be able to play it when I want to play it. And another thing is I just really enjoy making tapes, recording to analog tape. It's really just kind of a fun process. So that's something to think of. Another is if you drive an older car like I do, you may still have a tape deck, and it's nice to be able to just make recordings of things quickly and play them in the car without having to sync your phone and do all the other kind of jazz you have to do with modern setups. So many cars until the mid 2000s still came standard with a cassette deck. So that's another reason you might want to as well. Now, if you're a younger audiophile and you're just getting into cassette, I wouldn't dissuade you from doing it. It's a lot of fun, but there are some things to be aware of, one of which is that cassette decks are very complicated mechanical devices, and they do require regular maintenance and service on occasion, so that's something, they're not going to be super reliable, although some models are more so than others. That's something we'll talk about. Another is that blank tapes, you can still get some Type 1 blank tapes new, but you can't really get any good quality Type 2 tapes these days unless you're buying vintage tapes. Now, there are still a lot of tapes available on eBay and other sources, but to get unused wrapped tapes can be very expensive, so that's something to bear in mind. But like all hobbies, it's something you can look into the cost and figure out if it's something that might be good for you. For me, it's something that I'm always going to have, and I have a handful of cassette decks still that are a couple that are still in working condition. This is one of them that I acquired recently. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about the Nakamichi 480 in particular. So I was aware of Nakamichi cassette decks back in the 80s, mostly from subscribing to Stereo Review magazine. So I get to see all the latest models that came out, including the one that would physically flip a tape around for auto reverse to avoid misaligning the heads. The 480 I was aware of too for a different reason. It actually featured in one of my favorite movies and also soundtracks of all time, the movie Diva, which was made in 1980, came out in 1981, and I probably saw it sometime in the mid-80s. But this particular cassette deck features prominently in that movie in two important scenes, one of which is in the main character's loft. That's the blackface version of the cassette, and then a silver-faced version like the one that we have here, which an important plot element that the audience is aware of is revealed to the main character in his friend's apartment. So ever since I saw that movie, I always wanted to get one of the 480 decks, but you know, it was hard to get used decks back then. They had stopped making them in 1982, so it wasn't until the early 2000s when they started showing up on eBay that I was able to pick up a couple over the years. I had a couple of the blackface versions. Now these were both in pretty rough shape. They had been used and abused, and the heads were worn out, and they had lots of nicks and scratches. They actually were still very reliable, and I used them in the 2000s, but they didn't sound quite as good as some of my other cassette decks. So it wasn't until I got this one, which has pristine heads on it. It doesn't look like it was used very much, although it has been maintained over time. This one actually sounds good as well, at the level of other nice cassette decks I've had. Now, I've never had any one really high-end, you know, Nakamichi Dragon or ZX7 or any of those. But I have had some really nice ones, and we'll be looking at some of those in future videos. So the 480 was Nakamichi's entry-level cassette deck from 1979 to 1982. And despite being entry-level, it did not really have an entry-level price. The MSRP on this in 79 was $495. So if we put that into an inflation calculator, we can see that translates to roughly $2,170 today. So definitely not a cheap deck, especially considering that it's fairly bare bones and you don't get a lot of features. So the first thing that we notice if we take a look here is that it's a 2-head cassette deck. So unlike a 3-head cassette deck, you're not going to be able to monitor a recording while you're making it. It does have a soft eject, which is nice. So we can go ahead and open this up and pop in the tape and go ahead and hit play. And we have our basic transport controls over here. So one nice thing about these though is they do have these LEDs for the play, for the pause, which lights up if you pause, and also a red one for the record, which is pretty nice. We do have just a simple mechanical counter here with a counter reset. We have our input record level sliders, and then we have a couple of VU meters where we can monitor that for recording or for playback. And other than that, we do have a memory start feature here, real basic kind of memory, and then we have an MPX filter. We have Dolby noise reduction. Dolby C didn't exist when this came out, so that would just be Dolby B noise reduction. And then we have our tape type selector, which is using the Nakamichi types, SX, EX, and ZX, rather than the typical type 1, type 2, type 4 type thing. But it basically does the same thing. And then we have a real simple EQ button that we can use here. And that's pretty much it. Yeah, we don't get any kind of fine-tune bias, and there's certainly no auto bias with this deck. That said, though, I find that once you get used to using one of these things, you get a feel for it, and it's really not that hard to set the record levels for a particular type of tape and get a good recording on this thing. So why were they so expensive in relation to other entry-level decks? Well, even at this time, Nakamichi had kind of established a reputation for really good build quality and really good sound quality. And I think that's something that held up throughout the 80s. As the decks got more technologically and mechanically complex, they became a little bit less reliable. These 480s, actually, that's one of the great things about them is I've had 2 or 3 over the years, and they're very reliable. And if you can get one in good condition where the heads haven't been worn out from continual use in a studio or an auditorium or something like that, they sound really good as well. So let's take a real quick look at the back panel. So not too much going on here in the back. We do have a remote for a wired remote, which was optional. I do not have one of those to try out. But otherwise, we just have our analog inputs and outputs with the RCA connectors. So yeah, this thing's very simple, really easy to set up and start using. So let's take a quick look at the inside. So inside we have this rather large PCB that's mounted upside down. I'm not sure exactly why they did that. It may just be for ease of troubleshooting. But underneath the board there are a lot of high quality discrete components. And similarly in the front you can see there's this really heavy duty chassis for the transport. We've got some really high quality motors in here, a nice beefy flywheel, and everything looks really good quality. And you can tell that when you lift this up before you even open it because it's quite heavy. So a lot of the cheaper decks from this era would be light, and if you opened them up you'd have a small board with a few ICs in it and kind of a cheap transport and motors. So it's nice to see that this thing is really well built inside. So yeah, let's put it back together, get it in the system, and talk about how it sounds. So normally in a video like this I would compare the 480 to some other cassette decks, but unfortunately at the moment the only 2 decks I have are not quite up to the task. So this one down below is my Dual C839RC, which I got on eBay about 20 years ago and was my primary deck for about 10 years, mainly because it's just a really good sounding cassette deck. It also has a few more features than the other decks. It's auto reverse, for example, but it started having intermittent problems, and then 2 or 3 years ago it just stopped working entirely. So I may bring this to my technician next year to see if I can get it repaired. It's kind of hit or miss with these older decks. Some of them it's hard to get parts for, and so you may not be able to fix them, but I think this one is worth at least looking into. So the one up above here is my AWA 3500 that replaced it, and that was my main deck in most of the 2010s. This is also a great sounding deck, and it has a fair amount of features as well. The build quality on this one is not quite up to where the other 2 are, and you can see even when you just eject here we have this kind of clunky eject mechanism, but for the most part, it actually makes excellent sounding recordings, and so that was the main thing I wanted it for. And this deck actually is fully functional. There's nothing wrong with it. It just needs some new belts at the moment. And I have procrastinated for a long time because I'd read online, I'd done a little research about changing the belts, and it looks like it's pretty difficult on this deck. But I did finally get around to ordering some belts. They're on the way, and so I will be fixing this one, and hopefully we will be looking at it in a future video. This was the deck that I started the channel with. But these two hung out in my system for a long time because they're just very good sounding decks. The 480s I had mentioned I had previously had weren't quite as good. They were a little bit dull sounding compared to these two, which is why I eventually sold them off. But for this video, since we don't have another deck that we can compare it with, we're going to do something a little bit unconventional. So back in the early 90s, entry-level cassette decks had kind of gone down in quality. There were a lot of those dual well cassette decks that were convenient. You could make copies of other cassettes, but they typically didn't sound as good as the older ones, and they also weren't as reliable. I remember going through a lot of those things. There were still a lot of really good cassette decks in the early 90s. Some of the best cassette decks ever were made then, but they were quite expensive, definitely out of my range. So one of the tricks that poor musicians like myself used to do at the time to be able to record band practices and live recordings and things like that is we would use hi-fi VCRs instead, which actually do quite a good job at recording as well, and in a lot of cases would sound better than an entry-level cassette deck. And that's something I definitely did with some of the bands I was in back then. So I figured for this video we could do that. I do have this VCR, I think this one's from the early 2000s, and I have it just to be able to play some of my old VHS tapes, but I haven't actually tried recording anything with this one, but I thought it'd be fun to do some side-by-side recordings between this and the cassette deck and to see how they compare. So I thought a great way to test out the Nakamichi would be to make some recordings on it of CDs that are audiophile quality from my collection, just to see how well they compare, the originals to a recorded version on tape. And so to do this, I was playing my CDs through my Rotel CD11 CD player and listening through my solid-state setup here in my main stereo. So we've got a Schiit Saga S preamp running into a Vidar power amp into a pair of KEF LS50 speakers. And then we've got a line out going into the Nakamichi where I was making recordings, and then I would, because it's not a three-head deck, I would have to then play them back to hear what was actually captured on the tape. And an example of one of the CDs that I recorded was this one that I've showed you guys before, which is Transcending Continents and Memories from the MA Recordings label. This is a really great sounding audiophile recording to stereo mics. And I did try out a few different cassette formulations as well. So I've got a pretty large collection of sealed cassettes from back in the day that I've collected over the years. They all worked out pretty well, but I'd say I had the best luck with some TDK SA90s, like this one right here, that I bought in the late 90s, and I still have a few of those sealed. And they seem to do a little bit better than some of the other ones, but they all did pretty well. Now, this is a Type 2 cassette. And yeah, I was really surprised. Yeah, Type 2s do better in the high frequencies, but I was really kind of amazed at how much of the high frequency information was captured on the tape, including a lot of micro details. Now, yes, the micro details when you're doing A-B comparisons were slightly softened, but it was also capturing a lot of that air around instruments that I really love in recordings. Now, not all of it. It was some of it was lost, but it did a lot better than I was expecting, a lot better than I'd ever tried before on a cassette. So that was really pleasant to discover. Now, one place where it was a little bit more noticeably lacking was in the bass. It did just fine capturing bass, but Type 2 tapes in general have a little bit more trouble with the bass frequencies. And so yeah, a little bit more of the bass was being lost, but it still sounded perfectly good. To my ears personally, I'm much more sensitive to the high frequencies. And I should mention too that all the recordings I was making, I'm not using the Dolby noise reduction at all. I've never been a big fan of Dolby, even the later versions like Dolby S. To me, they always sounded like they were filtering out some of the high frequencies, which I don't want. And also, when you're recording on a good deck like this with a tape, you really get very little tape hiss. With these SA90s, it's barely audible, the tape hiss. So it's really, the noise reduction is really not necessary anyway. But yeah, in general, I was really amazed at the recordings that I was getting from this cassette deck. So I did do some recordings on the VCR as well, and those were actually surprisingly good, but they really couldn't keep up with the Nakamichi. So on those, I was just using these TDK hi-fi T120 tapes. And yeah, I would definitely qualify it as hi-fi sound, but it just couldn't really keep up, especially in the high frequencies, and some of those details that I was surprised that the cassette deck could pick up were lost with the VCR. So overall, the recording just sounds a little bit more flat, but still better than I was expecting. Now, I did also try to listen to some of my cassettes that I've collected over the years, and that was kind of a mixed bag. Some of those cassettes I literally listened to hundreds of times, and so those are sort of worn out, and some of them were recorded on less than ideal equipment, but some of them actually sounded quite good. I didn't have any new releases to test out except for this one. So I recently bought this when it was re-released by Dialect. It was a 2015 album that he had come out with that he re-released on Bandcamp. So I was able to download the Apple lossless version of this, and then I also ordered this cassette version, which came a couple months later. And I will say that this is not by any stretch of the imagination an audiophile recording, but it does sound actually pretty good. There are some sampled instruments, and they sound pretty good, and you can tell that it's actually a pretty good recording. Now, there wasn't much of a difference between the file and listening to this tape, but I did try recording onto one of these TDK SA90s on the Nakamichi from the Apple lossless, and that actually did sound even a little bit better than the tape I purchased. So that could just be the quality of the duplicating machine. I'm not sure what these blank tapes are that they use, but they actually are really not bad, and a lot better than you would really expect for sort of a novelty cassette release these days. So overall, I'd say that I'm very happy with the 480. It comes much closer to listening to vinyl and to digital recordings through a modern DAC than you would expect. And I think a lot of what it comes down to is the luck of the draw. When you're buying old cassette decks on eBay, most of the time in the past they're either not fully functional or they're pretty worn out and they don't sound nearly as good as they did when they were new. This time I think I really sort of lucked out. Now I paid just slightly over $300 for this, including the shipping and everything. That's about average. For a working condition 480, typically you'd pay between $200 and $600 depending on the condition. But this one is absolutely pristine and it sounds great. So I think I actually ended up getting quite a good deal on this one. So yeah, we'll feature other cassette decks on this channel in the future. And yeah, I will be putting belts on my AWA 3500 at some point. But for now, I'm very happy with the Nakamichi. And for the most part, I'm just using it to record radio shows that I like. And yeah, most of those radio shows you can download from on the internet. But it's nice to be able to record things when I feel like it, when I know something's going to be on, and have a really nice sounding recording. So yeah. In general, I'm happy with it. And I say if you can luck out and get a good quality deck, a used deck, obviously from the 80s or early 90s, this really can be a really good addition to your audiophile system. But yeah, I think that's it for this time, guys. Thanks for watching. I'll see you all in the next video.